Therese Muirhead, thank you for coming on the Illuminating Teams podcast.
Thank you. Nice to see you, Dan.
So I always start these with just a quick background. If you could let people know a little bit about yourself and take us on a little tour of your professional background and how you ended up working as an organisational psychologist.
Yeah, sure. So I was thinking about this actually driving this morning, and I thought it'd be good to bring in the fact that Dan and I used to run around Subiaco, which is a suburb of Perth, together in the 80s. And I think that lifestyle was definitely dominated by freedom and exercise and activity and running and jumping over people's fences. And I guess reflecting on that, you know, this value of well-being, both in my family and in yours. So I think that's kind of where my interest in being healthy and having positive well-being, I guess, was, germinated. I guess growing up and when I got to uni, I always really enjoyed the kind of psychology, anthropology, study of people units that I was doing. And it really connected to me as having a real strong desire as well to want to help people. I realised, having done quite a bit of work myself in recent times, that is an addiction that I am also working on. So for every strength, there is a shadow. I guess I've always also believed, and I still do, that the system of work, pursuing a career, building mastery in a certain area of passion, having a vocation, and engaging in growth, both personally and professionally, in the way that work allows you to do that, does provide purpose and meaning for people. And that's a really important part of positive well-being and happiness. So that kind of was sparked at university, and as I was having conversations with different people finishing my basic science degree, kind of was really keen to explore the opportunity to work in sports psychology, because I was drawn to the kind of theories and practicality of applying motivation theory and of people working in teams. But my supervisor at the time just straight out said to me, well, do you want to be employed? And I said, well, yeah, that's kind of why I'm at university. And they said, well, perhaps you should consider organisational psychology rather than sports psychology, because at that time, there was probably about 10 employed sports psychologists in Australia. So kind of switched into that interest to look at organisations, as most people work in the system of an organisation rather than in an elite sports team. So that really set me on my path to working and studying in the area of organisational psychology. And most of my jobs, both in organisations and as a consultant, has really been sharing my knowledge and experience to kind of test this belief of mine that people can and should be able to have a sense of happiness and positive well-being from work. And so that's kind of led me to focus on kind of the intersection between strategy and cultural development, working with leaders, working across organisations with teams and also with individuals to share knowledge around what builds happiness, what builds well-being at work, because we know from research that happier, healthier people are more productive, they stay longer, they live longer, and all those kinds of nice things that businesses are looking for. Along the way, I guess I've also focused on working on myself, and particularly in the kind of last 10 years, where a lot of the things that I've learned about in theory and the way that organisations implement these theories in the workplaces aren't necessarily sustainable. So change management programs or culture build programs to execute on a strategy might have a shelf life for as long as that CEO is around, or as long as there's a really tight-knit aligned HR or org development team. But when that person steps away or the team kind of moves their focus, those initiatives tend to lose a bit of motivation, and that the impact of the change kind of subsides. So I kind of turned the mirror inwards and thought, well, what is it about the practice that I'm doing and that most organizations do that maybe means that if we keep doing things the way that we've always done them, we're going to turn ourselves insane because they're not currently working. So just turning the mirror on myself more recently to understand, I guess, what I could be doing differently in order to achieve that sustainable change that is required to actually achieve the outcomes of positive wellbeing and health. So the work that I'm doing at the moment is now more, I guess, with a lot more curiosity and a lot more courage to do the things slightly differently than what I've always done. But that's part of that continual professional growth and that mastery that really drives me as a person as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks. And that, so were you working inside other companies, or have you worked sort of more as a consultant to companies so far across your career?
So really is a mix. I have worked in organisations in roles of org development strategist and org development manager roles, where mostly in businesses where there's kind of been a significant change in that industry. So in one not-for-profit organisation with the implementation of the NDIS, what does that change mean for that organisation's strategy and the way that they do work and the way that they engage with their people? So working internally to shift behaviours and shift skills to implement the requirements from an NDIS perspective. And another one was a big cooperative actually here in WA, and the grain market was deregulating and they wanted to build a one team culture, where in the past it was a kind of there was a Chinese wall, in fact, inside the business where the marketing and ops team couldn't speak to each other. And with the deregulation, that was no longer the case, and the leadership recognised that to execute the strategy of being that dominant marketer of grain, they had this opportunity to exploit with the knowledge and relationships to build within the organisation, but that would take more than that building trust and building relationships across those teams would be required to execute on that strategy. So those are the kinds of things that internally I've done. And then as a consultant, it's really about, I guess, liaising with leaders and understanding, mostly it's around a problem, or similarly, it's around, we've got this shift in our focus. Can you come and walk beside us and assist us to understand what that means from a leadership and behavioural perspective?
Okay, fantastic. There's so much to unpack, and I'm not sure where to start with your introduction as well, because I wanted to just ask you straight away when you were talking about finding ways to make sustainable change, if you've got any solutions. But maybe before we get to that part, we can take a step back, and I specifically wanted to talk to you about workplace wellbeing, which you've already mentioned several times as a key focus of yours. Because I think that's a really important topic for a lot of leaders. And so I wanted to also just start, I mean, you did say a lot about why it's important, but if a leader sort of was to come to you and say, why should I care about, they probably wouldn't say this, but why should I care about employee well-being, the workplace well-being? And not just, for the obvious reasons. Can you tell us why should they care? What's the rationale and the business case for looking after your employees and their well-being?
Yeah, there's lots of places I could go to start that answer. I think the more provocative one would be to say that lots of organisations come and say, oh, I'm really keen to work on my employees' well-being, and I truly value people, and I'm somebody who puts people first, because I know that if I invest in my people, it will lead to positive outcomes from an organisational sense. I guess the biggest thing for me at the moment is the cognitive dissonance between what leaders say they want, and then what actually you see and observe, and the work that needs to be done once you get in and you lift up the bonnet and understand the true starting place, if I can say it that way. And in relation to sustainable change, I think there's certainly an individual leadership aspect to that, but there's also a broader systems view. So I guess to kind of pull out again to answer your question, if you kind of zoom out and look at broader society at the moment, we're slowly waking up to the idea that the pursuit of endless growth and constantly driving for GDP increases is not sustainable. There's an alliance called the Wellbeing Alliance that's led up by an economist called Catherine Trebeck, and she's working with nations, so whole countries, like Scotland and Iceland, New Zealand. I understand Australia is dabbling with this idea, haven't seen any action yet. But she's working with nations to shift mindsets around what success looks like in terms of a more circular or donut model of economics. So it's not just about GDP, of course that's still important, but it's also about the health and well-being of their people, the number of green spaces a country has, how they engage in recycling, those kinds of things. And that that kind of idea or mindset of looking at the whole system and defining measures of success across the whole system is something that I see as really important for organisations as well. I think that this awakening will happen in organisations, and the ones kind of at the front end of the change process are already focusing on well-being in the workplace as something that is a driving factor that will allow you to achieve a multitude of different outcomes, GDP, or in this case, growth and revenue, but also well-being of people, productivity, sustainability, being able to change your business model to respond to different requirements from an ESG perspective and in terms of impacting on climate change and all those things. So for me, well-being in organisations is not just yoga programs and paying people maternity leave and DEI strategies towards achieving gender equity. It's a whole framework for a business to achieve sustainability.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you said there. And I think if we could unpack a little bit the term well-being to help people who maybe haven't been around this topic so much, because I think well-being as a general term in the English language is one that is thrown around quite a lot. So I wanted to sort of understand when we're talking about well-being, and particular workplace well-being, because I understand that well-being captures a lot of things, including in your private life. But I think if we focus on workplace well-being, what are the components of workplace well-being? What factors sort of fit under that?
Yeah, so the way that I think about it to kind of narrow that focus, so there's economists talking about this, there is psychologists talking about it too. I guess I look at it through the lens of positive psychology, and that is the research and application of practices of people who are flourishing or who have really high positive well-being. So I guess if you look at the study of psychology, kind of really blossomed out of the back end of World War II, it was kind of kicked off under the medical model, which is really about how do I fix pathology, or how do I fix people's problems? So the focus was on how do I heal PTSD or depression or anxiety. And I think well-being and certainly what positive psychology has done is to build that research and practice field around, well, what are the people who are thriving and flourishing? What are they doing? And is there any research? Is there any research that shows that these things do contribute to and lead to positive well-being? And if so, how about the rest of us understand some of that and learn to apply it in our daily lives? And I think if you kind of apply that model to how we study organisations, it's no different. So at university, or even when a leader calls me on the phone and says, I've got this problem, can you come and help me fix it? Positive psychology and certainly well-being research and practice is really along the lines of, well, what's working and how does that work, and what do you get when you apply your strengths, or when you have strong connections at work, for example? What does that mean that you can achieve, and how is that different from if we're simply focusing on all of the things that are going wrong? So I apply a positive psychology lens to kind of thinking about well-being and defining well-being. And the best thing about that is in the last kind of 20 to 30 years, there's just been an explosion of research and investigation into human flourishing and well-being. And the cool thing about this area of research too is that they're kind of moving away from this reductive medical approach. So it starts off by saying, well, humans are complex. So there's no one universal measure of well-being that, if you start measuring this and this improves, that your people are going to be overall more happier and healthier contributors in the workplace. It kind of pays homage to the fact that, humans are complex. So there's a number of aspects that the research, and certainly in practice and working with organisations, it's not about saying just measure positive emotion, for example. It's about, which is the, I guess, the ratio of people's time spent in a positive mood versus them in a negative mood. That's important, and that's one aspect to acknowledge. It's one component of wellbeing, which in the research we'd call subjective well-being. But it's also about understanding the more psychological factors of well-being, which I guess is more about things like, how much purpose and meaning do I derive from my work? What are the strength of my interpersonal relationships or my connections at work? How am I, building trust and those connections with the people that I work with? So long answer, but in a sense, well-being is made up of multiple constructs, things like meaning of life, positive emotion, the connections that you have, how much purpose and meaning you derive from the things that you do, make up well-being. And it's, I guess, an organisation's prerogative or decision point around, well, which ones would we like to measure, and which ones are we going to commit to as a measure to look at, well, if we're doing these things, does subjective well-being or psychological well-being improve in our employees as a result of implementing a number of things, for example?
So you mentioned measurement there. I want to jump straight into that then. So if you have all these components, how do organizations or teams typically measure? Do they typically measure workplace well-being? And if so, how?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, because most of the work that I've done over the last 20 years, it hasn't been measuring well-being. It's been measuring things like engagement or culture, which are slightly different constructs, I think. But I think 2023, this concept of well-being with the kind of upswell of focus on positive psychology, I think if you're not measuring well-being, then you're behind the eight ball. There's a fantastic set of tools on a platform called Work on Wellbeing, which you can actually pick and choose your own components, if you like, your own constructs that you are measuring within your team. And in fact, you can do that assessment at an individual level for free. It's just on workonwellbeing.com.au, and that's a really good place to start. And like I said, there's some main components that you get an understanding of your own individual well-being, but then as a business you can pick and choose which factors that you want to measure, including things like engagement and culture and the things that people have always measured. But I think certainly now, again, with that broader societal context of there's something else here that we're not currently measuring that we would like to measure, that is really with that wellbeing angle. I think that's a good place to start.
Okay, great. And on that, so say let's hypothetically imagine that I then, as a team leader, have done some research into the well-being of my team, and the results have come back in, and they are mixed, let's say, and I decide that I want to do something about it. Do you have any practical tips? I know you've talked about sort of larger, system change, but if at a more lower level, perhaps within teams where you don't have maybe that influence at the top on how you're setting up structurally, do you have any tips for leaders on how things they can do to go about changing or improving the well-being of their staff?
Yeah, so I think certainly at just a kind of one-to-many in a team situation, getting those results and understanding the different components of wellbeing is a really good first step. So, for example, the work around positive emotion and just understanding and building knowledge around emotional intelligence and how different emotions yield different emotions create different environments that are better for problem solving, for example. So if you're about to do a strategic planning session or like a creation session with a team, as a leader, just to know the impact of being in a positive mood will probably yield better results. And that if something's just gone down and the team is in a generally negative mood, that you want to go ahead with a session like that, that you've got to take some time to shift the mood in order to get the kind of cognitive thinking that you want in that session. So really kind of practical tips like that for leaders around those different constructs of well-being. The other side of that then, if that's the more subjective side, the psychological well-being for leaders would be, what's your purpose? What's the team's purpose? How are they contributing to the overall vision of the organisation and where they're going? Do people know how their effort makes a difference? So kind of getting at some of those self-actualizing characteristics. How does the people in your team know that the effort that they put in contributes to the overall organisation achieving goals? And how often are you having conversations like that and engaging the team on things like that? So there are things that the leader can do with the team. I think just one of my kind of criticisms of this area, and what I see organizations do all the time because it's easy, is we teach leaders these things, we teach individuals these things, but then we don't change the system. So as a really rough example, there's lots of businesses out there that are saying, flexible work is what we're all about. You can work from home. There's this time in the office that's important, but really the choice is yours, and we want to drive that kind of positive work-life balance. And as long as you're communicating, and here's some tools for communicating and updating a system to let us know when you're going to do it. But then I guess if you think of the broader system, where the intention of this strategy is that people can balance work and life more effectively. But I mean, we're in the middle of school holidays here in Australia, and kids get, 12 weeks of school holidays a year. And in Australia, the mandated amount of leave in the system is 4 weeks. So there's a big discrepancy there in our system of work between the amount of time our kids have off and the amount of time that us as adults or as parents have off to participate in our kids' lives. So on the one hand, if the individual and the leaders have got the tools to, be flexible in their work and communicate, and we say that as a business we value this time, but the system is still set up to only give you 4 weeks out of 12 leave a year, there's a mismatch there between what we're saying and the system that confines us. You can't make a free choice in that respect. You have to confine within the system. So yes, there are some practical things individuals can do, but the sustainability of the change depends on how willing the business is to actually change the system that the individual sits in as well.
And yeah, it's a very good point. There's only so much you can do within the constraints you're provided with. Say you're a team leader and you do want to talk more about your employee well-being. Is that, do you recommend normally that that's done with the whole team at the group level, or more is it generally done at the individual level? How do people tend to approach those conversations?
Yeah, so I think one of the conditions for this to actually work, if you are a leader of a team, is that you need to have trust with your people. And that's kind of the basis of any work with people, is to build that level of connection and trust at the outset. And I think to your question, I think that needs to happen in a one-on-one setting, and in a team environment. I think it's both, rather than an either or. The other thing I'd say about this, and it kind of goes with any work in this area, is that you've got to start with yourself. You've got to be across this yourself. That's why I'd suggest that anyone would jump online and do the work on wellbeing and understand what the constructs are looking at. Use yourself as a scientific experiment, because the old telling people what to do is just, there's absolutely no research in the world of a dictatorial leadership style working, and working to achieve productivity and well-being. And so the best way to do that is to understand the concept yourself, look at yourself and look at your own well-being and your own positive emotion score and your own sense of purpose and meaning, and how you're achieving that through your work, and then engage in a trust building exercise with individuals and with the team. We know what contributes to well-being. Positive psychology literature shows that happier people contribute more. We know this, but we're not doing any of it. And the way that an individual can contribute to that being broken down is by showing the way and understanding how that works for you, and sharing that with your team.
With this conversation around well-being, it would be amiss not to just touch on where we were and where we are now. So obviously, or from what I understand, workplace well-being was severely impacted during the pandemic. And I just wanted to get your opinion on how things have changed. How much has it recovered, or in what ways has it changed since we've, in this post-pandemic period?
Without sounding really cynical, I don't think much has changed. And I think what I see is, so if I can kind of go backwards. So for example, things in Western Australia, there are now laws for workplaces to create and foster a psychosocially safe work environment. So if you are a business and you put through a change program, and as a leadership group that change is not managed effectively, leaders aren't visible, there's some disrespectful behaviours going on, those things can be reported to a governing safety body as not providing a psychologically safe work environment. So just like a physically safe work environment, those laws are there to protect workers from a governance perspective. Now, I get that this is a really important place to start. It's similarly the place to start with things like achieving equity in leadership teams, for example. So ASX companies in Australia are required to have X percentage of women on their boards and in their leadership teams. So typically where people start with these changes is a governance approach, which is great, but it's not the only thing to do. So what I've seen coming out of the pandemic and this opportunity to create a truly flexible work environment, where companies tend to start is, we'll mandate that you have to be in the office 2 days a week, but you can choose what 2 days they are, and the other 3 is up to you. So again, the perhaps easier route, or the easier thing to do, is to create the rules or the policies that appear to tell people, we have a flexible work environment here, and this is something that we've learned from the pandemic. But again, if being in the office, if it's a culture where being in the office and being in front of people and people seeing you in those leadership roles helps you to achieve promotion, for example, and maybe those things aren't measured, but that's an aspect of culture that everybody sees, then I don't think that the full learnings of the pandemic will ever be achieved. In that example, by simply focusing on the kind of governance rules or policy changes that are easy to make as a result of these learnings. So, and I guess it's part of the kind of reason why this concept of well-being or flourishing is such an important one to look at, because there is research to show that, as well as the rules, these are the things that we need to be doing in a business in order to fully promote that we are a flexible workplace, where you have choice over where you work and you have autonomy over the things that you do and when to come to work and things like that. So I think that the pandemic was again another thing that happened, another opportunity to show us that what we're currently doing in organisations needs rethinking, whether or not leaders, CEOs, chair people and directors have the gumption and the courage to actually shift some of those system reinforcing factors is yet to be seen.
My hope is that this is also somewhat sorted out in a private market way, in that it will be driven more by talented people who say, I will only work remote or distributed, and so in order to compete for talent, you have to shift as an employer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, again, that's the power of the system of work. So we can sit and wait for governments to legislate all of these requirements, or we can be part of an organisational system that truly values wellbeing and truly understands the impact of wellbeing in creating not only a profitable business, but a sustainable one. that those private enterprises and organisations that are kind of early adopters or first movers in this field are the ones that win the war for talent and are the ones that keep people, because they provide an environment where not only the person can make a basic income, but that they can build really strong relationships where they can work on something that contributes to, you know, them fulfilling their purpose and gives them meaning, and one that is fun and that allows you to have more positive emotions than negative emotions.
Absolutely. I think that's a fantastic way to sort of round out the conversation. So one final question I did have was, and that I like to ask everyone, is if you have a book or a podcast or any sort of resource that's had an impact on you recently or otherwise, or to your approach to work, or that you could recommend to others.
Yeah. So in the spirit of not kind of following instructions or limiting myself to one, I think the early work of Martin Seligman, who's kind of the father of positive psychology, is such an important place to start, to understand the kind of well-being mindset, and kind of challenging this really strong model in business and in health at the moment, which is how do you fix pathology, or how do you fix the problems, to what are the happy, healthy people doing? And, you know, his work is over 20 years old now, but it's still something that every time I pick it up, I've got here Authentic Happiness as one title of the book. You know, every time I pick it up, it's still so relevant today, and something that if all leaders could kind of just be challenged on that mindset, it would be awesome. I think in terms of business, the person who writes about this from a kind of qualitative study perspective a lot is Jim Collins. So his early work around Good to Great, where he looked at the difference and compared organizations that are, you know, doing well, doing good, to those who are sustainable and who are long lasting and who are great, and what are the differences between those two organizations, and what are they actually doing. And then in terms of work on yourself, I can't go past Brené Brown as a starting point, because a lot of what we've been talking about in terms of leaders going first and building trust is about kind of demonstrating your own vulnerability and being courageous to be able to do that. And I think she not only writes and studies this, but she uses herself as a scientific experiment in every conversation she has. And I think there's so much to be learned from that kind of approach. So 3, not just 1.
Absolutely. Go 3. Certainly, I know Brené Brown, but the first 2, there's some reading for me to do afterwards as well. So thanks for those. And
No
I just wanted to finish off. I know you recently started your own consultancy as an org psych. So if people want to find out more about the work that you're doing, can you tell us what's the name of the organization or your consultancy, and where they can find you?
Yeah, so I guess having been practicing for 20 years and, you know, a number of times thinking at the end of an assignment or you know, being kicked off an assignment because I'm pushing too hard, I I have decided to, yes, build my own business. And I think the thing that the why is that I'm chasing my own dream, to be able to work with people who have a similar belief that I do, in that organisations in their current form are not set up to work for people. So how do we build organisations that are systems where people can thrive and flourish? So the why for me is working with fellow dreamers and fellow disruptors, to be able to really challenge that system of work to create flourishing. And the business is called The Other Arc, because in a lot of the work that I've done, and in just kind of thinking about this conversation, is kind of challenging that dualism. So, you know, I truly believe that it's so easy at the moment to be an either or. So I'm right, you're wrong. You know, it's not a blue sky, it's a purple sky. And just the opportunity that people can get to see different solutions to problems from considering the other or the other arc, I think is such a great opportunity to be able to problem solve some of the gnarly issues that are kind of on our plates at the moment in 2023. So I'm the other arc on LinkedIn. And yeah, just hit me up, or also follow me, Therese Muirhead, as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Therese, for your time. It's been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan, and have a great rest of your day.
Cheers, you too.